Hey everyone, welcome to WittCode, where in this video I'm going to show you how to create a group chat using Java sockets. So the first thing, this is our project here. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this program, which is the server, and then these three are going to be clients that are going to be able to message each other. And to start this, I'm just going to run the program that we'll make called Java Client. You can see when you start the client, it says enter your username for the group chat. When you start the server, it doesn't say anything at first. If you say you start, you can run multiple clients, of course. So you run one here, enter your username from the group chat. For this one, I'm going to say my username is WittCode. And you can see on the server it says a new client has connected. In this one, let's enter the group chat as well under the user pizza guy 7. If we enter that, you can see a new client is connected. And also for someone who's already in the group chat, the server will say pizza guy 7 has entered the chat. And then let's say we have, of course, a third person can enter. Java client. The username for this guy, I don't know, could be soccerdude89. And now you see it'll say soccerdude89 has entered the chat. Here it says soccerdude89 has entered the chat. And the server, of course, is just saying who's connected. And now we can just send messages to each other. So I'm going to say, hey guys, my name is WittCode. And you can see both users who are connected get this. And then you can respond being like, what's up, man? And you can see we get it here. Of course, you don't get messages that you send to yourself, so you can see it just says, what's up, man? But this guy, for example, gets both WittCode, and then he'll say, hey, everyone. And you can see that everyone is just communicating. And of course, you can send multiple messages. Like, you can send as many as you want. So, hi, how are you? Wonderful weather. Things like that. It'll just keep going. And then another thing you can do is once you disconnect, so say you're a user in here, and WittCode leaves, it'll say server WittCode has left the chat. So it lets everyone know that he's left. And you can say like, oh man, why did WittCode leave? And you can see we still get that message here. And we could say, I know, right? What a bummer. And then, yeah, so this is what we're going to be building using Java sockets. So let's get started with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to close out of all of these. I'm essentially just shutting that down. And then first thing, let's just create a new project. So we can start this from scratch. It's just going to be Java. I'm using Java version 8. And so let's just click through. No templates or anything. And then just put this in a location that you'll remember. All right, now that our project seems to be set up, let's just create our first class. The first thing we're going to be working on is our server. So our server class will be responsible for listening to clients who wish to connect, and when they do, it will spawn a new thread to handle them. And I'll of course explain this more as we go on. But first let's add some properties. So this class is going to have a server socket object. So server socket, and we're just going to call it server socket. And this object will be responsible for listening for incoming connections or clients and creating a socket object to communicate with them. And so now let's make the constructor that will set up our server socket. So I can actually do a shortcut of, Alt and then insert and just do constructor and generate it like this. And now let's make a method called startServer, which will be responsible for keeping our server running. So I'm just going to do public void start server like this. And now within here, the first thing I want to do is let's make a try block, because what we will do in here, we'll need some input, output, error handling. And now we want our server to be constantly running until the server socket is closed. So basically we want our server running indefinitely. So what we're going to do to make this happen is we're going to run server socket while the server socket is open. So while it isn't closed. And while it isn't closed, what we're going to be doing is waiting for a client to connect. And this is done with the server socket.accept method. And this method, server socket.accept, is a blocking method, meaning our program will be halted here until a client connects. However, when a client does connect, a socket object is returned, which can be used to communicate with the client. And so this socket object, we can just create like this and set it equal. And then, if you can remember, all I did was I just outprinted a new client has connected. So when I when I ran the program or typed in a username, you remember the server would say a new client has connected. So that's what this does here. And now we're going to create an object from a class that we haven't actually made yet, and it is called ClientHandler. So don't worry about this for now because we are going to be making this momentarily, but let's just set it equal to new ClientHandler. And so basically each object of this class will be responsible for communicating with a client. And not only this, but this class will implement the interface runnable, which of course you'll see in a second soon, but runnable is implemented on a class whose instances will each be executed by a separate thread. And this is vital to the functioning of this application, because if we didn't spawn a new thread to handle the connection with each new client, our application would only be able to handle one client at a time. This will make sense more as we actually implement this class, but for now, just keep this in mind. And also, when we make this class, we will give it a constructor that accepts the socket object that was created from our accept method. So we're just going to pass in the socket like this. And of course, once again, you will see the reason for this when we work on this method. Now, as I just stated, when a class implements the runnable interface, the instances of the class will be executed by a separate thread. Specifically, whatever is in the overridden run method of the class that implements runnable is what is executed on a separate thread. However, to spawn a new thread, we first need to create a thread object and then pass in our object that is an instance of the class that implements runnable. Once again, I feel like this will definitely make more sense as we create this class, but for now, just come along. So we create a new thread, and then we pass in our instance of our class, ClientHandler, that we haven't made yet, but that will implement runnable. And then classes that implement runnable, objects made from that class, can then run on a new thread, and to do that, we have to pass it into or create a new thread object. And then we use the start method to begin the execution of this thread. So this just creates the thread, but to actually run it, we need to use the method start. And then let's just handle our input-output exceptions that come from working with sockets. But we are going to make a method actually, a simple method for handling the error so that we can avoid nested try catches. And this method, so I'm going to create it here, and it's going to be called public, or it's going to be called close server socket. And this method is used because if an error occurs, we just want to shut down our server socket. But first, let's make sure our server socket is not null, because if it is, then we get a null pointer exception if we called the close method on it. So we're going to have to do our try catch in here, and this is why I like making a method, so I don't have to do like another try within here. I just think it looks messy. And then I'm just going to do if server socket is not equal to null, then what we want to do is close the server socket. So close it like this. And then of course we need to handle the errors in here, which is more input-output exceptions. And here let's just print the stack trace. And then so we've set up our server class. Let's just create a main method that we can actually instantiate a object from it and run it. So I'm just going to have public static void main to run our program. And so let's create a server socket by doing new server socket. And then what we pass in here is a port number. And this basically is saying our server will be listening for clients that are making a connection to this port number. So when a client is going to basically have a socket and they're going to send out saying to the server, hey, I want to talk on port 1234. So this number has to match when we create our client, which you'll see later. But then the reason we're doing this is because our server object, you can remember, takes a server socket into its constructor. And then to run our server or keep our server constantly running, we made the method start server up here, so we'll call that here. And then for this, I'm just going to add the exception to our method signature instead of doing a try catch. But now let's start working on our client handler class. So within here, so what we were making up here, let's actually implement this. So I'm going to go over to source here and create another class. I'm just going to call it client handler. And then let's close this. And if you remember, this class will implement the runnable interface. So I'm going to do implements runnable. And this will make it so that instances will be executed by a separate thread. And to do this, when we implement this interface, of course, we have to override the methods. And I believe it's just one, which is called run. and I'll explain this method more in a bit. But for now, the first thing we're going to have with this class is a static array list of every client handler object that we have instantiated, or basically every instance of this class. So we're going to call it public static array list, and it's going to be of the type, so it's going to hold client handler objects. We'll call it client handlers. Let's, of course, import our array list, and we'll set that equal to new array list. And so the main purpose of this array here is to keep track of all our clients, so that whenever a client sends a message, we can loop through our array list of clients and send the message to each client. So this array list is basically responsible for us allowing to communicate or send messages or broadcast a message to multiple clients instead of just one or just the server. And so you will see this being implemented soon. And then also this is static because we want it to belong to the class, not each object of the class. But now let's add some other properties that our client handler will need. So the first property we're going to add is a socket object. So I'm going to do socket. And this will be the socket that is passed from our servlet class. This is of course used to establish a connection between the client and server. And next what we're going to be making is a buffered reader. So buffered reader. And this will be used to read data, specifically messages that have been sent from the client. And then after that, we're going to make a buffered writer. So buffered writer. And this will be used to send data, specifically messages, to our client. And these will be messages that have been sent from other clients that will then be broadcasted by using this array list. And more on this you'll see. And then finally, we're going to have a client username that is used to represent each client. So private string client username. And now let's start working on our constructor. So if you can remember, instances of this class will be passed a socket object from our server class. So remember in here when we were creating client handler, you can see we're passing in a socket. So we need to accept that in our constructor. So socket like this. And now we're going to first set up our class properties. And we will do this inside of a try block. Once again, because of the input-output exceptions. And the first thing we're going to do is just this.socket equals socket, which essentially means this is the object that is being made from this class. For that object that's being made, set the socket of it equal to what is passed into the constructor here. Let's go back in here. And however, though, we have to set our buffered reader and writer from our socket. So if you remember, a socket basically represents a connection between our server or client handler and our client. And each socket connection has an output stream that you can use to send data to whatever it is you are connected to, and an input stream that you can use to read data that whatever it is you are connected to has sent to you. So let's first set up our buffered writer by using the socket's output stream, and we can get the socket's output stream by using socket.getOutputStream. And then we can wrap this with something called an output stream writer. More on this in a second. So really quick, in Java there are two types of streams. There's a byte stream and a character stream. And we want a character stream because we are sending messages. And in Java, character streams end with the word writer, while byte streams end with the word stream. So this is a character stream, this is a byte stream. And this is why we're wrapping our output stream our byte stream in a character stream, because we want to send over characters. And then finally, we're going to use a buffer, which will make the communication more efficient. So we're just going to do this.bufferedWriter equals new buffered writer, and then we wrap our stream, our character stream, with this to essentially increase efficiency. And now let's just do the exact same process with our buffered reader. So this.bufferedReader equals new buffered reader, and then we're going to do not an output stream, but an input stream reader, and then the same thing we can do is get an input stream from our socket, which is essentially saying this is what our client is sending, and this is what we are going to use to send. So we use this stream to send things and this stream to read things from. And next, whenever a client starts a connection, the first thing that happens is their username gets sent over. So if you can remember, when we typed in that command prompt, it would say, please enter your username for the group chat. You'll see this, of course, when we implement our client class, but what we're going to do is we're going to set that as our username. So our client username, this.client username, we're going to set that equal to our bufferedReader.readLine, because what's going to be sent over from the client is a line, which basically means they type in text, press the enter key, which sends over a new line. We read that, and we first set that over as the client's username. So remember, we read from a buffered reader. Also, we are reading a line because when the client presses enter, a string will be sent over along with a new line character. So we want to read from the stream up until a new line character, which means the user has pressed the enter key. And then the next thing we're going to do, which is really important, is add the client to the array list so they can be a part of the group chat and receive messages from other users. So we're just going to use the array list add method, and then we're going to pass in this, because you remember it takes client handlers. This represents a client handler object, so we're passing it into the array list of client handlers. And we are then going to send a message to any connected client that a new user has just joined the chat along with the user's username. So if you can remember, when a new user joined, it sent to anyone that was already connected their username, and it said like server, they have already connected. And we will implement this method soon, but for now, just know that this is what it does. So we're going to use a method that we're going to create called broadcast message to send this to the other connected clients. And it's just going to say server and then client username as entered the chat. And next, we're going to catch the input-output exceptions and close down everything. And we're going to make a method for this so we can avoid nested try-catch blocks again. But let's just do catch input-output exception this. And this method, what it's going to be called is close everything. And it will close down our socket and also the streams. So let's pass in socket, buffered reader, and buffered writer. So of course we haven't made this yet, but we haven't made either of these methods, but we will soon. But now the method we're going to be working on now is this run method. And this, if you remember, is the method that we had to override when we implemented the runnable interface. And everything in this method in here, so everything in this run method is what is run on a separate thread. And what we want to do on a separate thread is listen for messages, because listening for messages is a blocking operation. And a blocking operation basically means that the program will be stuck until the operation is completed. So if we weren't using multiple threads, our program would be stuck waiting for a message from the client. So instead, we're going to have a separate thread waiting for messages and another one working with the rest of our application. Because if not, our program would basically be sitting here being like just waiting for messages to come in. What we want to do is we want to also be able to send messages. We don't want to just have to wait for someone to send a message before we can actually send one. So let's first have a string variable that will be used to hold the message received from a client. I'm just going to call it string message from client. And then we will be listening for messages from the client while there is still a connection with the client. So this will be an infinite loop again, at least infinite in terms of how long we're connected to a client. And we're just going to do while the socket is connected, which means while we're connected to a client, let's listen for messages. And then because we are listening for a message from the client, what we're going to be doing is reading from our buffered reader. So we can set message from client equal to buffered reader dot read line. So basically the program will halt here until we receive a message from the client. And this is why we want to run this on a separate thread. This is a really important concept. We want to run this on a separate thread so the rest of our application isn't stopped by this line of code here, because this is a blocking operation. And then what we are going to be doing is, of course, we want to broadcast this message with that function that that method that we haven't made yet, but we want to broadcast it. And then let's handle our input-output exceptions with also that other method that we haven't made yet. I think it's called close everything, and then socket, buffered reader, buffered writer. So two methods once again that we haven't made yet. And then also a very important thing to put in as well is break. So basically when the client disconnects, this will break us out of this while loop. Because if we didn't have break right here, that would essentially mean that it would just keep printing this keep doing this like over and over again, because we'd try this again, it would fall back to our catch. So we'd run this method and we just keep running this method. So this is important to have this break method or break keyword right here. Now let's work on our broadcast message method, which will be used to send the message a client wrote to everyone in the group chat. So I'm going to make this, of course, after this, I'm going to call it public void broadcast message. And of course, it takes the message that we want to send. And so if you remember, we have an array list of client handlers. So this array list up here. So we can loop through it and send a message to each client connected. So let's loop through our array list. So to do this, we'll just use a for loop, and we'll do client handler, client handler, client handlers, which essentially means for each client handler in our array list, this will represent each, this right here, this object will represent each client handler each time for each iteration through this array list. It might make more sense as I type this out, but of course we're going to have another try block. And then we want to broadcast the message to everyone except the user who sent it, because we don't want a broadcasted message sent that you wrote yourself. And this is actually why we have a client username property. So this is where this comes in handy. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if the current client handler in the array list that is being used in this for loop, if the client user of the name of that equals, we use equals because it's a string, client username, then, so if it doesn't equal, so basically if it doesn't equal, then we'll broadcast the message, or we'll send the message to that client. So the way we do that is we use, of course, our buffered writer, because each client handler object has a buffered writer that we use to send data, specifically using our sockets output stream. But so we're going to do buffered writer, and we can use the write method, and it can take a string. And what we want to send is whatever is passed into this method. So right here, this message, we want to broadcast it. And then next, something that's really important is because on the client, they will be waiting for a new line because they'll be using read line. This doesn't actually send over a new line character. We have to explicitly do that. So we'll do client handler dot buffered writer dot new line, which will successfully send over a new line character, which is essentially equivalent to pressing the enter key. So this new line character essentially says, I'm done sending over data, so no need to wait for any more data from me. And then the final thing we need to do is flush our buffered writer. So we're going to do client handler dot buffered writer dot flush. And this is because a buffer will not be sent down its output stream unless it is full. The messages we are sending probably won't be big enough to fill the entire buffer, so we need to manually flush it. Like if you know, like if you're watching like a Netflix show or something and your connection gives out and you see that buffering, that's basically the buffer waiting to be filled enough, like to be filled completely until it's sent over. And so we're essentially like doing that just prematurely before the buffer is actually full. And then finally, let's just gracefully close everything with that method that we will make soon. So once again, not on our if statement, but on our try, input output exception, and we're just going to do close everything, pass in the socket, the buffered reader, and our buffered writer. And now the next method we will make is a method to signal that a user has left the chat. So if you can remember when we disconnected, we got a message to every user that's still in the group chat saying that they disconnected. And we're going to call that method remove client handler, because we're removing a client handler essentially. So remove client handler like this. And so within this method, the first thing we want to do is remove the client handler from the array list. So we're just going to call our array list, which is called client handlers, and we're going to remove this, which is the current client handler. And this is because if the user has left the chat, we don't want to send them any messages anymore because the connection is no longer there. And then let's just broadcast a message saying that the user has left so everyone in the group chat knows. So if you can remember that from the demonstration, we said something like server, and then what the server said was client username has left the chat. So this is all we need in this method. But now let's make our close everything method that we have been using. So we've been using this a lot. Let's actually implement this. So this is just going to be public void close everything, and it takes the first as a socket, The second is a buffered reader, and the third is a buffered writer. And so once again, this method is used to close down our connection and streams. First though, let's call our remove client handler method, because if the close everything method has been called, this basically means the user is leaving. Because basically whenever there's a catch block that's been called, it means something, either the user left or an error occurred, so we're removing them from the group chat. So this is where we actually call this method. And then we're just going to close down everything. So we're going to have to do this in a try catch, and we're also going to have to check if first make sure everything isn't equal to null, so that when we call the close method, we don't get a null pointer exception. So this is another reason why I made this a separate method, because we'd have to write all these if statements and everything in each one of these, so it's nicer to just have this. Also, no more nested try catch, which I'm just not a fan of personally. And then close, and then finally check if our socket does not equal null, and if it does, we're just going to close it. And then let's just catch our input-output exception. And for this one, we're not going to call this method unlike an infinite loop. We're just going to print our stack trace. And now, one quick note on actually closing sockets and streams. One is that with streams, you only need to close the outer wrapper, as the underlying streams are closed when you close the wrapper. So we only need to close our buffered reader and our buffered writer, and not the output stream writer, input stream reader, and all that. And also, closing a socket will also close the socket's input stream and output stream. So those are just some things to keep in mind. But now, let's begin working on our final class, which is our client class. So this project will be 3 classes in total, and this final one is just going to be client.java. And this class will actually be very similar to our client handler class, except we are going to be using threads to deal with blocking operations a little differently. So we're not going to implement the runnable interface, which you'll see. But so we need a socket. We need, same reason as before, we need our buffered reader. We need a buffered writer. And we need a username to represent the user. And also, you may notice we don't have a main method in here, because essentially this is being run from our thread. So this object here, when we call start, this is essentially what is going to run this, not actually writing public static void main. So that's just something else to keep in mind. But let's just go keep working on our client. So then let's create our structure or a constructor that will be used to instantiate every property. So just public client, and of course it takes a socket object for communication. So socket and or communication with our server or client handler, and it also takes a username, string username, to actually represent the client. So let's instantiate everything similar to how we did in our client handler. So we're just going to do this .socket equals socket, and then we're going to create our buffered reader and buffered writer from our socket object. So remember how we do this, and then socket dot get output stream, and then same with the buffered reader. We are using that for efficiency. What is this? Input stream reader, and then get input stream. And then with our username is just going to be the username that's passed in here. And then of course, let's do our catch IO exception. I don't know what that is, but we're just going to do an IO exception, and then we're going to actually use that method again. Close everything. It's going to be essentially the exact same, just a little different. And then buffered, just close everything down again, which you always want to close down. But let's now create a method called sendMessage. You can probably tell what it's gonna do. But so sendMessage, and this will of course be used to send messages to our client handler, or basically the connection the server has spawned to handle a client. And then we are of course going to do our usual try statement in here. And the first thing we are going to do is send the client a username over, because if you remember, when we run this program, it first says, please enter your password, or enter a username for the group chat, and then we send that over. And so this is, so essentially the client handler can identify us. So here we're going to do bufferedWriter.write, and we're going to write over our username. So the buffer client handler knows who we are, and then we're going to send over our new line, similar to how before, and then we're going to flush it out because the username will probably not be big enough to fill the buffer. But let me show you where this will correspond. So this, what we're sending here, is what is the client handler will be waiting for here. So as soon as we create our client handler, it'll be waiting for the client's username to be sent over. So this is waiting, essentially readline is waiting for this first message when we write over the username. And then after this, what we're going to do is we're going to create a scanner object. So scanner like this. I don't know if you remember, but this is essentially just how we can get input from the console. And then basically we will continue to send messages while there is still a connection to the server. And similar to how we did earlier, so we'll say while socket.is connected, and what we will do is get what the user typed into the console with our scanner and then send it over. So the way to do that, I'll make a variable called message to send, and we use the method scanner.nextLine, which essentially when the user presses enter in the terminal after typing in, that will be captured in this variable here. And then we're going to use our buffered writer to write this over. So and the way we're going to do this is we're going to say username, which will basically be like, remember how when I typed something like WittCode, it said WittCode and then said this. So that's how we're implementing that. So it'll be like this, and then actually send over the message to send. So what the user typed into the console. And then similarly, we just have to write a new line over, and then we have to flush it. And then once again, let's just gracefully close everything with a method that we haven't made yet, which takes the socket, the buffered reader, and the buffered writer. And now we're going to create a method for listening for messages from the server. And this will, of course, be the broadcasted messages from other users. So we're going to be listening out for messages that have been broadcasted. And we're going to call this public void listen for message. And this is where we're going to have to use a new thread again, because as we will be listening for messages, this will be a blocking operation. And we don't want to spend our whole time waiting for a message and not being able to send one. But we're going to be doing this in a different way than implementing the runnable interface. Instead, we're just going to create a new thread and pass a runnable object. So we're going to do new thread, and if you remember, the thread constructor takes a runnable object or a class that implements, or an object of a class that implements the runnable interface. And then remember, what is placed inside this overridden run method is what will be executed on a separate thread. If you want to know more about runnable, I made a video, actually I think a year ago, that went over this, and so if you want more information on it, I'd recommend checking that out. But let's just keep going. So first, we're going to get go in here, we're going to create a string, and we're going to call it message from group chat. And then once again, we only want to do this while we're still connected to the server. So while we're connected to the server, we're going to read from our buffered reader. So we're going to read the broadcasted message, and then we're just going to output it. So we're going to output what was sent from the server. And then we're just going to catch this, and then calls, I'm just going to copy and paste this actually. And then we're going to call this method, again, close everything down if something went wrong. And then of course, our new thread object here, which seems to be, I think it's maybe an anonymous object, I don't know if that's a thing, but that we have to call the start method on it. So we're not like referencing this at all, we're just creating an object and then just calling start on it. So this in here is basically going to be waiting for messages that are broadcasted from in here. So when it sends out, each client will have a separate thread that is waiting for a message, and when it's sent, so it'll loop through each connection, send down the message, and then for each client, they'll have a separate thread waiting for it, and when they get it, they'll just print it out to their console, so they'll see what every other user has said. But now, let's create our close everything method. So it's going to be what was it first? I believe a socket, a was it buffered reader? Yeah, buffered reader, and then a buffered writer. So buffered writer, buffered writer. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to take this from here. It'll be the same as here, except of course we're not going to be calling our remove client handler method because we don't have an array list of client handlers. This is just a single client. But now at the bottom, let's create our main method to run everything from. So let's first create, what we're going to do first is we're going to create another scanner object. We'll see why in a second. And we use system.in because we're taking input from the console, or from the keyboard essentially. And then this is where we're going to say, enter your username for the group chat, like this. So this is where we're going to tell the user when they run this program, enter a username to connect to the group chat, and then we're going to set string username equal to scanner.nextLine. So whatever the user types in and presses enter, we'll capture that in this variable, and then this of course be used to get the client's username when they start the program. But now let's create our socket object that will be passed to the client. And if you can remember, the server is listening on port 1234. So we need to specify that number. So if you can remember when I went back here and talked about the server socket listening on 1234, this is where on the client we need to try and make a connection to the port that the server is listening on. So we're going to make a socket object equal to new socket, and then the first actually is technically the IP address that you want to connect to. But for us, it's localhost because it's our own computer. And then next is the port, which is 1234. And then let's create our client object. So client, new client. And what it takes, of course, is a socket object and then a username. So this is, we're just instantiating the class we made right here. And then finally, let's just run our two methods to listen for messages and send messages. So we're going to do our client.listen for message and client.send message. And both of these methods here are technically blocking methods because they both have infinite while loops, or at least while they're still connected. So this one is while the socket is still connected, and then send message is while the socket is still connected. So both of these will be running. So basically our program will halt here. Because these are separate threads, they will both be able to run at the same time. So this one here, essentially, if it wasn't on a separate thread, we'd be stuck here and never really allowed to send messages. But this is our whole program. I'm just going to add this to the method signature again. But this should be everything. But one thing is we want to be able to run multiple clients. I'm not going to do this from the terminal like I did in the beginning. I just thought that was a cooler way to show it. But for this, I'm going to run it like this. I'm going to just click this play button here and run server.main. So our server should be running. So our server is running successfully. And then for our clients, we want to run this too. So let's do, not edit configurations. The way to be able to run multiple is I think I have to run this first. So first, let's run a client. You can see we have enter a username for the group chat. But let's go to here, edit configurations, and then I think if you go to modify options here, you can allow multiple instances. So if I click on this, press apply, and then OK, now you can see we have a play button again, so I can basically run this program multiple times. So now you can see I have 4 clients. But let's do the first one, WittCode, and the next one, let's do Pizza Man, and this one, I don't know, Mike. And then let's see our server, a new client has connected. Let's say, and look, here we go, WittCode, Pizza Man has entered the chat, Mike has entered the chat. Hey Mike, hey Pizza Man, and let's check, make sure they got the messages. Yep, Mike has entered the chat. Hey Mike, hey Pizza Man, hey WittCode. And then, hey, WittCode, this guy got both of them. What's up, guys? So this was, yep, and they all got that too. And now let's just disconnect one of the clients. So he disconnected. And we have WittCode has left the chat. It's always WittCode, it seems. And then let's disconnect this one as well. and says Mike has left the chat. So Mike is the only one left now. But so this is the program though. If you have any questions or anything, let me know in the comments. I'll try and get back to you. I'm probably going to try and make a next one of these kind of group chat things incorporating like a GUI like JavaFX. So if you're looking forward to seeing something like that, I'd recommend subscribing. But besides that, I guess I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.